the reason why I got interested in the question of cybernetics was there is a very, say, luscious discussion on cyberspace and how we regulate cyberspace. And that discussion has led to many different proposals, but it backed always one question. Where does the word cyber come from? Okay, it comes from cybernetics. Why is cybernetics not discussed as a topic in and of itself, except for in engineering, but not so much in the governance domain? And that is something that bugged me a little bit. Specifically, when we look at the word cybernetics, it comes from kybernan, to steer, Greek word for steering, or the steersman. And governance comes from the Latin word gubernare, which is a bastardization of the Greek word kybernan. In other words, they are the same word. So how does it come that as governance scholars, when we refer to cyber, we do not immediately think of cybernetics as a theory of regulation, a control theory? And so I thought maybe it is useful to bring the two into better conversation. And this is what I'd like to do today. Bring the topics of cybernetics and governance together. Why? The more technologies converge, the more technologies come together on single platforms, the more they bring with themselves governance aspects. They bring with them regulations that already apply, that have been invented before, that they raise new ethical issues, they cause new standards. And what we find is that there is a convergence not only of technologies, but at the same time, these technologies cause a convergence of governance frameworks. When we then think of technologies themselves also as a tool of governance, cybernetics, through the lens of control theory, this idea of regulation becomes even more amplified. Then we don't only have regulation through norms and principles, but we have regulations also through technology. Through that lens, then, we have a very wild mix of regulatory frameworks that come together just by converging of technologies. But it is a wild mix of regulatory mechanisms. Let's take a more neutral term, regulatory mechanisms or tools that, depending on the discipline, are either seen or not seen. And with cybernetic governance, I'd like to make them all visible, but then also try to see what can we draw from cybernetics for governance in order to solve those Gordian knots, at least a little bit. So what I'd like to do today is I'd like to use the example of super soldiers in order to illustrate what cybernetics and governance mean, how technology convergence causes governance convergence. And the reason why I took super soldiers was because there is an increasing debate amongst the military circles about the human as a platform. So in 2014, Obama, famous for his very emotive speeches, came forward and said, basically, I'm here to announce that we are building Iron Man. People were chuckling, people were slightly amused. And so what he presented was the Tactical Assault Light Operator suit, or in abbreviation, TALOS. This operator suit was meant to enhance the capabilities of the soldier on the battlefield, not only the physical capabilities, but also cognitive abilities and so forth. At the same time, the director of national intelligence, John Radcliffe, came forward and criticized China for also working on super soldiers, specifically super soldiers that are enhanced through gene editing and biotechnologies. And he called for regulation. we need to regulate enhanced soldiers, because there is no such regulation in society. My point that I've already tried to make in the introduction is that regulation for new phenomena might be important, but when we deal with the convergence of old phenomena that result in new phenomena, adding more regulation might not always be the best idea. Sometimes we need different tools to solve those issues. So my presentation will really converge on the topic of governance and convergence through the lens of the super soldier. I would like to then discuss what is cybernetics and how does it relate to governance, and then draw from cybernetics, specifically from traditional control theory, very simple control models, and from Ashby's law of requisite variety, some principles of governance that can help us to solve that governance Gordian knot, so to speak. And please interrupt me if I'm at any point not understandable due to my Austrian accent or the content of my presentation. Then just let me know. All right. Cyber governance or cybernetic governance. First, I wondered, where do the two come together? Traditionally, when we look at governance, governance tends to be more located in the field of say, policy, management, law, political science. This is where we find the discussions on governance. Cybernetics more traditionally inhabits fields of the hard sciences, with the one exception that is management and economics. And we find here actually an interesting convergence, governance being also a topic that is being discussed there. And that interesting convergence is specifically governance from the perspective of management, or management cybernetics as a topic that has emerged specifically in the 70s. So from that perspective, cybernetics, the consideration of any sort of system as a system that is affected by disturbances and that needs to be regulated in some way in order to be controlled, is viewed. And Birnbaum came up with the idea that institutions actually work as cybernetic systems. And these cybernetic systems can be regulated and adjusted by, in his view, ideally administrators that have a good overview of other administrators' tasks. And so they help to adjust the overall, regulate the overall system. So they coordinate and balance various subsystems in order to make it more efficient. Another approach to cyber governance was Karl Deutsch's work, Nerves of the Government. And he viewed cybernetics or cyber governance specifically through the lens of information management. How do different information streams inform the behavior of a system? How can these streams be shaped and directed in order to better govern complex systems through the application of complexity theories? At the same time, we find that is so in the 80s, we find Günther Anders' work gaining more popularity, specifically his work on the obsolescence of man. And with that work, he introduces the concept of the cyberneticization of society, society being run by numbers. And that is something that we have criticized in the past and that we have witnessed as well. And that is the dominance of digital technologies that are being used to both gather data about citizens, but also the use of those technologies to control and nudge behavior in desired directions. So his critique in the obsolescence of man is really something that we saw as a dystopia becoming reality. But I think one specific example, and that is the example that you see here in the picture behind me, is of interest. And that's a project called CyberSyn, introduced by the Chilean government in '71 and run by a American cyberneticist, management cyberneticist, Stafford Beer. And he was invited. His work was on management cybernetics. He had developed a theory, the viable systems model that aimed to apply a cybernetic theory, control theory on organizations. So he was invited by the Chilean government to implement those theories in reality. And the idea was to run the whole country through the principles of cybernetics. With other words, they installed telecom systems in all the factories and had data on the employees, the resources, the productions, and so forth, transferred to this control center. This is a digital replication of how they envisioned it. And there, a higher order level system would manage the efficiency of the overall country and the production through this centralized system. Well, the project ran till 1973, because in 1973 we had a coup. And so that project ended there and then. Funny enough, I just found a 2023 paper recently, also from Latin America, that proposes the system now for Bolivia. So the idea of the cybernetic management of society is not dead. Not as dead as we would hope it to be. And it does painfully remind us of the last chapter of iRobot, where the whole world is governed by 5 computers. At some point, it goes out of hand and nobody can point the finger at the problem. Now, conceptually, cyber governance requires us to rethink traditional governance. It requires us to rethink the traditional entities that we're looking at, the resources that we are considering as relevant, and the means of regulation. And we've worked on that with a former PhD student, Gilles Hasenberg. And you see here an overview. It would go beyond the scope of this to go through all those in detail. But let it be said that there is a change in what we need to see as entities that need to be governed, with tech companies becoming much higher in importance of being governed, because they are relatively elusive as multinational corporations for single national governance structures. In addition to that, online interest groups, whether that are hacktivists, cyber criminals, etc., that require further engagement. And we saw that in initial engagement with the US installing a liaison officer to communicate with people from Anonymous, who launched cyber attacks against ISIS. #OpISIS, maybe you can remember. They took down all the social media accounts which were necessary for the intelligence community to know what ISIS was actually doing. So that required them to interact with those entities. And of course, also digital entities, and that are the discussions that we're having increasingly nowadays, specifically ever since ChatGPT is awing all university professors in how badly written student essays can become even worse when written by AI. But there's also new kinds of resources that we need to consider, and one is specific resources that haven't been considered in traditional governance theories are specifically human capital in the sense of attention and intellectual space, intellectual property as a governance and steering tool for large-scale administrative purposes, specifically when it comes to social media, for example. The digital infrastructure that we rely on, that is increasingly being seen, at least by the military, as the 5th domain of warfare, cyberspace. and the method of extraction for data, which is considered widely the new oil, artificial intelligence. And also in terms of regulation, we see new possibilities when we view it from a cybernetic lens, namely code as law, Lessig's idea that also software can regulate, but also user interfaces regulate. Remember the olden days of Facebook, where there was no emojis, but only thumbs up. There was thumbs down was impossible to do. Protest was impossible. Blockchain as a regulatory tool, both on-chain and off-chain, as well as automatized decision-making. So we see, when we look through this wider lens, or these multiple lenses at technology, then when technologies come together, it becomes a little bit more complex than it used to be. And when the technologies come together, we would refer to that, and I take that from work of Dirk and his team, technology convergence. Technology convergence, he defines specifically as an increasing ubiquity and pervasive distribution of computing capabilities across physical objects and biological organisms that causes, by extension, an erosion of a clear separation between the physical, the digital, and the biological. And it becomes naturalized in a way. It becomes increasingly hard to detect and to protect from, because it becomes also more and more self-evident. There is one underlying issue here, and that's why I'm very curious also about your presentation. There's one underlying issue that is at the heart of that. And the underlying issue here is the issue of interface. Inter, between, facere, to do. So there is something between our doing and the effects that we try to cause that is in between, right? And what is in between? Traditionally, we have seen that we had to operate with mouse and keyboard. And I recall very well when I told my mom, you have to put the mouse over there on this box. She took the mouse and put it on the screen and was surprised that it didn't work that way. But the interfaces became more naturalized, right? Now we have iPads and we can actually click on the buttons that we see. And we try to remove the barriers between the mind and the digital domain more and more. And this barrier is being seen as the big obstacle. But it is also probably one of the safeguards that we still have. And this is why it is important to consider cybernetic governance very seriously. And that's why we need to consider technologies as regulatory frameworks. Let me then have a look at an example of super soldiers. And this is really taken from a ministry report by the German and by the UK ministry, Bundeswehr Office of Defense Planning at the UK Ministry of Defense. And they are coining the term the human platform. Euphemistically, we would say, but they don't even mean it euphemistically. They consider the human to be the perfect platform for technological augmentation. And examples that they bring are, and I can share it with you, of course, examples that they bring are the exoskeleton, then sensory augmentation, so sensors that can give a sixth sense, so to speak, or a seventh, if you may want. Neurostimulation as a mode of increasing speed in learning.
I was funded by the Ministry of Defense for that very project.
Were you? Oh, wow, wonderful.
Didn't work.
Didn't work? Good. Good to know. Good to know. And this is even your picture?
No.
And then a tele-existence, which is the existence in a different place, not only telepresence, like through, the robot behind you, but indeed then the ability to interact as if you were there, and the immersion that is aided by virtual reality and so forth. And then, of course, genetic engineering as a tool for enhancing physical capabilities, other biotechnologies, nanotechnologies, and so forth. Now, put that all together in the Robocop here, put it all together in one human being, and you find that with the convergence of these technologies, a lot of governance frameworks converge. Frameworks on the regulation of AI, privacy and data regulation, questions on medical regulations, such as, for example, we have the Nuremberg Code for Human Experimentation. We have the Helsinki Declaration for Clinical Research that come into play here. In the US, the Common Rule on Human Subject Research. So already just on the biological side and human experimentation, there's a lot of frameworks to consider. Now, place that in the context of armed conflict, right? We have human rights law that continues to exist in armed conflict that is only augmented as lex specialis by international humanitarian law, which also applies on top of that. Apply also then in parallel the other regulations that haven't been derogated from, i.e. the GDPR and so forth, and you have a wild mix just of regulatory frameworks. And now add to that our thinking that we said technology is also a regulatory framework. How do we deal with that complexity? And this is where cybernetics or cybernetic governance might come in handy. Looking, I think I need to soon stop, but give me a few more moments. Norbert Wiener decided to call this field cybernetics based on the word steersman. And I think particularly interesting is his definition of what it means. He says, if physics is the science of understanding the physical environment, then control theory or cybernetics may be viewed as the science of modifying that environment in the physical, the biological, and even the social sense. So we are really talking about control theory, and some basic principles that that I can maybe bring along now for our discussion later is we're dealing with input and output into a system to be controlled or controlled object that is affected by disturbances. Now, ideally, the signal leads to a desired output. The difference between the desired output and the actual output is what we would call signal error. In order to be able to adjust for that error, we need what we call a feedback control. In other words, we need to measure the output, feed it back to the control system, and adjust the input in order to get the desired output. That is what we call feedback control. As part of that, Ashby had to deal with a problem. He had to deal with the question, how do we adjust for the variety in disturbances? Because if there are no disturbances, ideally, signal leads to desired outcome. The disturbances are what lead to non-desired outcomes. So for disturbances, we need regulation or regulatory mechanisms. Now, his invention or finding really was that, and he proved that mathematically, that the more there are disturbances, the more we need regulations to solve those. And he phrased it and coined it in a very succinct phrase, namely, only complexity can destroy complexity. But what does that then mean? If we look at the complexity that I've just painted, the complexity of the super soldier being governed not only by this multiplicity of legal and policy frameworks, but also by the multiplicities of technologies that come together. Clearly, then we need either a lot of different frameworks, or we need to reduce the amount of technologies that are allowed to be converging on a platform, or we need a different solution. So what are the implications? When regulatory variety increases, we have a big problem. We have a problem of gaps and overlaps, that feedback loops that are not anymore predictable. But we also have the problem that regulatory clarity disappears. And that is a big problem for us lawyers in the room. We would call this a problem for the rule of law and for legal certainty. And that is an ethical problem, because if we cannot rely on the law anymore to give us clear guidance, then law becomes useless and very haphazard. So the alternative would be to decrease the variety. That might lead to new regulation that limits the amount of technologies that can be integrated in such a human platform. The question is that realistic? Is that something that warring factions, the military, would abide by? Or is indeed necessity the dictate of the possible? A last alternative that one could then consider is to wonder, is it possible to regulate the different mechanisms that are already coming together, not through a new regulation, but through meta-regulation? In other words, to formulate a system or develop a system that both understands the different frameworks that are at play as governance frameworks, so technologies, data infrastructures, software and code, but also the norms and policies, understand them all as regulatory mechanisms, and then devise a system on a top layer that helps us regulate those subsystems. And right now, this is really where I am at the moment, because devising such a meta-regulatory framework that understands the subsystems well enough is still something that I can understand theoretically, but I cannot yet see practically how that would be implemented. But I see it also as the only possible mechanism to solve the conundrum that we are otherwise facing. And I'm very much looking forward to your questions and your input. Thanks.
Who wants to moderate? Wish I can do that too, but yes, please.
I have a question about this, about the example that you also showed about Chile, and you mentioned that in Bolivia there is this attempt now to reintroduce these ideas of cybernetic governance. And I'm always wondering, when you look at the case of China, for instance, there is also this tendency of making those 5-year plans and strategic investments and so on. And yeah, I mean, today, all of these ideas should be much more powerful because there is much more data and much more data type infrastructure, right? So I don't know where I find whether you explored anything when thinking about it, but do we see more of those tendencies coming back beyond the example of Bolivia, or is there, because I find the communist or socialist angle on this cybernetic idea very, very fascinating. I think it's much better than for Western societies or capitalist societies.
Much better in sense of the socialist perspective is more adaptive to the cybernetic idea of governing society. I think you're absolutely right. I think this is something that seems to be coming, the Planwirtschaft, the planned economy is something that comes very natural to a sort of socialist governance framework. And so it does come as little surprise that those ideas are very easily embraced in those governance systems, in those political systems. But I think the desire to control societies comes also on the other end of the political spectrum, because in the end, politics is about controlling societies. So I think that in the end, there is a general tendency away from granting too much individual agency for the sake of streaming what might be seen as, decreasing resources, competition over resources, and so forth. And I view that as a big problem, because that's the last resort we have as human beings. To be ethical is to be an individual agent. Emily, don't tell me that you've done research and we don't have that anymore. Yeah, go ahead.
I think that point is so true. And whenever I kind of open my mind and dip my toes into this topic again, I just think, maybe you and Dirk feel the same. Like it's kind of, I don't know, we're doomed in a way. Like it's really like I don't know, are we going to maintain this? Especially with some of these neurotechnologies, are we going to be able to maintain like our individuality and our individual citizenship? And I don't know. I have a pessimistic view, and I don't like confronting that.
I have a question. Are you suggesting by your presentation of control theory that you believe that we could use control theory in this classical cybernetic sense to control what's coming? Is that your belief that it's there where you find? And I'm where I'm coming from is because I'm currently studying a book by Karen Barat, and it's called Meeting the Universe Halfway. She's a philosophical quantum scientist, and she explains to us how everything that happens is at the moment where it happens already a diffraction gate to other things that are going to happen. Everything we measure is already influenced by the apparatus, also that was originally the quantum experiments bit apparatus. Yeah. So what I'm getting from reading this book and also seeing that in human computer interaction, there is a very interesting paper called Entanglement HCI, where we see suddenly a trend to understand our world rather in quantum phenomena than in control theory, in the classical Norberg-Wiener kind of mechanisms. And that is why I asked you originally whether you really want to go down that path of control theory, because I would rather, starting to think about what quantum macro quantum mechanics would mean for our social interactions with technology. And I hope I think your very, very last sentence that you made, that in the end, it's really the ethical agent, as the ethical individual, virtuous person that might be the simplest unity to target.
Well, Sarah, you have given me so much to unpack here. It's lovely. So I think I've read similar literature, and I'm engaging with colleagues on the subject of quantum theory in social science. And I think Quantum Social Science is a book written by Alexander Wendt that might be interesting for you.
The Quantum Mind.
Yes, the Quantum Mind.
It's on my shelf.
It's on your shelf.
Yeah.
Lovely. So Alex, a dear colleague, and we are working on other projects right now together, but his idea really was that in order to explain certain societal phenomena that we cannot explain through not even bounded rationality, and that is where also control theory needs to rely on, at least on that bounded rationality, can only be explained by what he might call societal quantum superposition, or superposition of possibilities that manifest in the time of measurement or experience. So I think this is the one way out. I do not try. What I'm trying to show here is that we have a conundrum that we need to solve if we want legal certainty, and law has always been a means of control, right? It's in and of itself a control theory. From a legal perspective, I was curious, what does it mean when we combine governance and cybernetics? But I think what is not dealt in here, that's something where you point at, is if we view individual agency through that lens, namely that lens that allows us this agency of choice in the superposition or situations of superposition, I think this is where we can actually escape the confines and the dictates of what otherwise control theory would predict. And this might be the cause for why control theory ultimately in societal terms might not work. So, control theory is based on a very mechanistic worldview of physics. One that quantum physics is fundamentally second guessing, but only on the micro level so far. So on the macro level is where everything averages out and the universe behaves as if quantum physics doesn't exist.
Yeah, that's what it is.
I wonder. I don't
think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, my impression is that it's not on event, it's Barat, it's the HCI community.
Yeah.
This is already common knowledge. Also, let's say common knowledge among, let's say, pioneers like you guys.
I understand quantum physics not well enough to be claiming that. So
one interesting question is really how will quantum computing really change the way the world works? And I think we have no idea. Quantum physics is really fundamentally different.
But I think so in my understanding, this work is not about quantum computers that may or may not come at a certain time, but it is about people like Alexander Wendt, Karen Barat, and HCI scholars who are philosophers or political scientists who argue that social mechanisms at the macro level can be best understood through the lens of quantum mechanics.
I'm aware that we were talking not about the same thing here, but certainly technology is here opening a new front in terms of rather than classical, everything tends to go quantum now, and that was fundamentally different.
I mean, there is huge investments right now, 650 million in the quantum delta in the Netherlands. And if you're interested to become a director there, it's currently a call for applications. I just got a message from a friend. And the question really of this quantum delta is, what are the societal implications of quantum science on society?